April 30th, 1945. The 7th day. The underground of Berlin. The air in the tomb that had once been a U-Bahn transit tunnel was stagnant, heavy and dense like compressed felt. It was woven from a myriad of smells. The acrid concrete dust that never settled, the stench of creosote and dampness ingrained in the walls, the sour odor of unwashed bodies, and fear, which had its own coppery, salty taste, like blood on the lips. 4 of them, 4 living ghosts, walled up in the heart of an agonizing city. They no longer counted the hours, no longer divided the day into light and dark, because light and dark did not exist here. There was only an eternal velvet blackness, occasionally pierced by the dim, almost spectral light of a dynamo flashlight, which they used only in extreme necessity, conserving its fragile life. Sergeant Orloff sat with his back against the cold, damp wall. He was 32 years old, but now, in this gloom, his face resembled the mask of an old man carved from gray stone. Deep wrinkles cut across his forehead and settled at the corners of his eyes. And in the very depths of those eyes, all the cold and all the darkness of this dungeon seemed to be frozen. He wasn't sleeping. Sleep had become a luxury, a dangerous weakness they could not afford. He was listening. In this world, reduced to the size of a few dozen cubic meters, hearing had become the primary sense, the main guardian, and the main tormentor. He heard the breathing of his men, the ragged, barely noticeable breath of Private Zuboff, who lay a few meters away, curled into a ball, trembling in his sleep like a cornered animal. The steady, almost inaudible breathing of Corporal Lysenko, who sat opposite, hugging his knees, staring into the void with his faded, all-understanding eyes, and the old man's wheezing sigh of Private Starogin, whom everyone simply called Dead, because he was a grandfather, a veteran of that first German war. Orloff listened to their breathing, but he was really listening to the silence, to the absolute, oppressive, almost tangible silence at the center of which, like a dark deity, rested she. The 500-kilogram, 1,100-pound British aerial bomb. Their silent neighbor, their jailer, their judge. Her blunt nose was almost completely hidden in the rubble of concrete blocks, rebar, and twisted metal that had cut them off from the world 7 days ago. Only her massive olive-gray body and stabilizers, resembling the wings of a giant metal insect, protruded. She lay so close that one could reach out and touch her cold, slightly rough skin. But no one did. They were afraid even to look in her direction, as if a mere glance could disturb her fragile, deadly slumber. They used to say a sapper makes 2 mistakes, the first when he chooses the profession, and the second when he gets blown up. Orloff had always considered it a stupid joke. Now he understood its literal, monstrous meaning. They, the professionals whose job was to look death in the face, to disarm it, to take it apart, had become its hostages, mice in a cage with a python. And the most terrifying thing was not that she could explode. The most terrifying thing was that she could explode from any of their actions. From a careless movement, from a word spoken too loudly, from a stone falling from the rubble. Their enemy was vibration. The slightest tremor that could run through the ground, through the air, through their own bodies, and awaken the beast sleeping in her steel womb. So they created their empire of silence, a cruel, totalitarian dictatorship of whispers and slow-motion movements. Orloff felt hunger, dull and relentless, gnawing at him from within. The water canteen had been empty for 2 days. Now their lips were dry and cracked, and their mouths tasted of dust and iron. But thirst was nothing compared to the tension that was incinerating their souls. It was like a thin string stretched to its breaking point, and they all felt it. A little more, and it would snap. Snap from Zuboff's madness, who was muttering more and more in his sleep, or from the despair that was slowly like a poison seeping into their blood. The sergeant slowly, millimeter by millimeter, turned his head and looked at the rubble. In 7 days of grueling, almost silent labor, they had cleared a negligible amount. They passed the stones down a chain with their bare hands, afraid to use even a shovel, let alone a pickaxe. Their fingernails were broken, their fingers worn to the quick. And the rubble, it seemed, did not shrink. It was like a mythical hydra. For every stone removed, 2 new ones appeared. Sometimes from above, from the world of the living, a dull, barely audible rumble would reach them. It was the artillery cannonade. It meant the fighting was somewhere very close. But for them, this sound was not a hope, but another source of terror. Every distant explosion sent a tremor through the ground and into their hearts, and they would freeze, turning into stone statues, and wait. Waiting for the final deafening counterstrike that would turn their little hell into a fiery void. But the explosion never came. The bomb remained silent. She was waiting. Orlov closed his eyes, trying to banish the viscous, sticky thoughts. He was not a philosopher. He was a simple sergeant, a sapper who knew his job. But here, in this darkness, alone with death, he began to think about things he had never considered before. About the fragility of human life. About the thin line that separates order from chaos. About how man's most terrible enemy is not another man with a weapon, but his own fear locked inside his skull. He felt his soldiers watching him, even in the dark. They were waiting for an order from him, a decision, a miracle. He was their leader, their rock, their last hope. But he himself was at his limit. The steel rod inside him had thinned to the width of a hair. He was afraid, not of death. He was used to that. He was afraid of breaking, afraid of giving the wrong order that would kill them all, afraid of watching his men, his comrades, turn into animals crazed by thirst and horror. At that moment, he did not yet know that the most terrible ordeal awaited them, that the enemy was hiding not only in the steel casing of the bomb and in the multi-ton rubble, but also within themselves. And to understand how these 4 professionals, the elite of the engineering corps, ended up in this grave, buried alive beneath the capital of the Third Reich, one must go back 7 days. To that day, April 23rd, 1945, when their world had not yet shrunk to the size of this tomb, and they still believed that for them, the war was almost over. April 23rd, 1945. The outskirts of Berlin. Spring had come early and brazenly that year. It burst into the ruined city with the scent of blooming lilac, which mixed with the bitter smell of burning, creating a nauseating, surreal cocktail. The sky was clear, a piercing blue, and against it, the black columns of smoke rising over the city seemed particularly sinister. Sergeant Orlov's sapper squad had settled down for a short rest in the ruins of some German house. All that remained of the building was a single wall with the empty eye sockets of windows and part of a basement where they sat, stretched out on the wreckage of furniture and old rags. This was their world before the disaster, fragile and temporary, but still a world where they could smoke, speak in full voice, and even laugh. Sergeant Orlov, a stocky, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered red, was meticulously cleaning his submachine gun. Every movement was measured and precise. He didn't like haste. The war had taught him that haste was a direct path to the grave. Next to him, leaning against the wall, dozed Private Sterigin, or simply dead. He was over 50, and the war had carved deep furrows into his face as if a plow had passed over it. He was thin, wiry, and his gray, disheveled hair stuck out from under his ushanka, which he never took off, even in warm weather. They said Dead could identify a mine by its smell and disarm a fuse with his eyes closed, using only his intuition and an old cobbler's knife. He rarely spoke, but every word he uttered carried weight. A little further away, on an overturned crate, sat Corporal Lysenko, tinkering with something. In his thin, almost musical fingers, pieces of wire, gears from broken clocks, and shards of glass came to life. Before the war, Lysenko had been a watchmaker in a small town near Vitebsk, and this love for fine mechanics had stayed with him. He could fix anything, from a radio to a lighter, and he did it with such absorption as if there were no war, no death around him. He was quiet and unassuming, but Orlov valued him for his sharp mind and astonishing calmness. The youngest and loudest was Private Zubov, a 19-year-old boy with defiant eyes and a perpetual smirk on his lips. He sat on a pile of bricks, excitedly telling some tall tale, gesturing animatedly. For him, the war was still an adventure, a terrible but thrilling one. He'd not yet seen its true, grueling, dirty underbelly. He was eager for a fight, dreaming of heroic deeds and medals. Orlov listened with half an ear and shook his head. He knew that war quickly knocked the arrogance out of hotheads like him. It either knocked it out or buried it with them. "And then this Fritz jumps out from around the corner," Zubov chattered. "And I give him a burst right on the helmet. Clang! And that's it. His running days are over, my pretty." Dead Starigan, without opening his eyes, grumbled. "You're a noisy one, lad. The noisy ones don't last long in a war. Death loves silence." Zubov just waved him off. "Oh, come on, Dead. Don't be a jinx. The Reichstag is just a stone's throw away. We'll crush the beast in its lair, and then it's home to the girls." At that moment, a lieutenant, their platoon commander, came down into the basement. Young, fresh out of officer school, but already battle-hardened. "Orlov, to me," he said curtly. The sergeant got up, brushed off his trousers, and went to the officer. They spread a worn map of the city on a crate. "All right, Sergeant." The lieutenant jabbed a finger at a point on the map. "Our task is to secure a passage for an assault group right here. This is the government quarter. According to intelligence, the Fritzes have turned the whole area into a fortress, especially the underground communications. Everything is mined. But there is one route." He drew a line along a blue thread marking a metro line. "The U-Bahn tunnels. If we go through them, we can come out right behind their main positions near the Reichstag. Is the task clear? Your squad goes first. Check the tunnel for mines, surprises, and secure it for the others." Orlov nodded silently. He didn't like underground passages. There was something unnatural about them for a soldier. Confined spaces, darkness, no room to maneuver. A trap. But an order was an order. "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant. How much time do we have?" "You have no time, Sergeant. Move out immediately. The group is already waiting." Orlov returned to his men. "On your feet, Eagles. We've got work." Zubov jumped up, his eyes shining. "What is it, Sergeant?" "Onward, to the Reichstag." "Onward, Zubov. Only underground." Orlov smirked. "They've decided to make moles out of us." Lysenko carefully put his tools away in his rucksack. Dead Starigan rose with a groan, adjusted his ushanka, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. They checked their equipment. Probes, mine detectors, explosives, flashlights. Everything was in place. Their work did not forgive negligence. 10 minutes later, they were standing at the entrance to the metro. A black, rectangular hole in the ground from which emanated a smell of dampness and oblivion. The stairs leading down were littered with garbage and debris. Somewhere in the depths, water was dripping. That sound, hollow and lonely, was the only thing breaking the silence. "Well, God be with us," whispered Dead Starigan, and was the first to start descending. The others followed him. They plunged into the darkness, leaving behind the sunlight, the scent of lilac, and the sounds of the nearby battle. With every step down, the world of the living grew more distant, and the sounds of war became more muffled, as if they were sinking to the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. That evening, before receiving the order, Corporal Lysenko had taken a small photograph from his tunic pocket. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and 2 small children. He looked at it for a long time without taking his eyes off it, as if trying to memorize every feature of their faces to absorb their warmth. He didn't know that this was the last time he would see them in the light of the sun. He didn't suspect that the thud he would hear in a few hours would not be an enemy shell, but the deafening impact of a multi-ton concrete slab on the tunnel arch, which would bury them alive. The descent into the abyss was slow and tense. The steps of the staircase, covered in slippery mud and broken glass, disappeared into the impenetrable darkness. The air grew colder and thicker, filled with the smells of mold, rotting organic matter, and the ozone characteristic of a subway system. Dead Sterigin went first, his figure barely visible ahead. He moved almost silently, his feet in their worn-out boots seeming not to touch the ground. Behind him was Orlov, gripping his submachine gun ready to open fire at any moment. Lysenko and Zubov brought up the rear, with Zubov stumbling every now and then and cursing loudly in a whisper. "Quiet, you bear," Orlov hissed at him. They descended onto the platform. The station was plunged into darkness. Only faint beams of light breaking through holes in the ceiling far above snatched the outlines of columns, scraps of advertising posters on the walls, and piles of garbage from the gloom. The silence here was different from the surface. It was oppressive, viscous, filled with an invisible threat. Every step they took echoed hollowly under the high arches. They turned on their flashlights. Narrow beams of light tore the rails from the darkness, stretching into the blackness of the tunnel. On the track stood the skeleton of a burnt-out train car, its shattered windows resembling the empty eye sockets of a skull. "Check the platform," Orlov commanded in a whisper. "Dead. Lysenko. Right side. Zubov. With me. Left." They split up, slowly sweeping the floor with their probes, carefully examining every centimeter. This was their routine, their craft. But here, in this dead silence, their usual work turned into a ritual, a dance with death. Any suspicious object, any pile of trash could be a trap. But the platform was clear. "Clear, Sergeant," Sterigin reported. "Mine too." They gathered at the tunnel entrance. A black, perfectly round hole from which a grave-like cold emanated. "Now for the interesting part," Orlov muttered. "Same order. Dead in front, 10-meter distance. Move only on my command." Eyes peeled. Sterigin nodded and without stooping stepped onto the rails, dissolving into the darkness. His flashlight became a small, trembling star. The group moved after him. They walked along the sleepers, trying to step as quietly as possible. The tunnel walls, covered in tiles that had crumbled in places, reflected the light of their flashlights, creating a play of bizarre shadows. Water dripped monotonously from the ceiling. Drip, drip, drip. This sound, the only one in this kingdom of silence, grated on their nerves, drilling into their brains. They had gone about 300 meters, nearly 1,000 feet, when Sterigin, up ahead, raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Orlov went up to him. "What is it, Dead?" The old man silently pointed his flashlight beam forward. On the rails, about 20 meters, roughly 65 feet away, lay something dark. "Maybe a body?" suggested Zubov, coming up from behind. "Maybe not a body," Orlov replied. "Could be a surprise with a tripwire detonator. Wait here." He slowly walked forward, carefully scanning the space in front of him. Coming closer, he saw that it was the body of a German soldier. He lay on his back, arms outstretched, his eyes open and staring at the dark arch of the tunnel. There were no mines or tripwires nearby. Orlov signaled to the others. They approached. Zubov kicked the body with his foot. "He's done for the Fritz." "Don't touch it." Orlov stopped him sharply. "You don't know what's under him." He crouched down and shone his flashlight on the dead man's face. He was just a young boy, almost a child. "Volkssturm," Sterigin identified. "Just a greenhorn." They moved on, leaving the dead man to lie in the eternal darkness. This encounter only intensified the oppressive feeling. The tunnel was turning into a catacomb, a realm of the dead. And it was at that very moment that the earth shook. First, a deep, guttural roar reached them, seeming to come not from above, but from the very bowels of the earth. Then the tunnel shuddered like a living creature in agony. Plaster and small stones rained down from the ceiling. "Get down!" Orlov yelled, instinctively diving between the rails. An impact. A deafening, crushing blow that seemed to split the world in two. Their flashlights went out. Absolute impenetrable darkness fell. the air filled with the roar of crumbling concrete, the screech of tearing metal, and dust that instantly clogged their noses and throats. The ground gave way beneath them. They were thrown, tossed like wood chips in a storm. Orlov felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. His head slammed hard against a rail. Consciousness faded, drowning in the roar and chaos. It lasted an eternity and an instant. And then came silence. A dead, ringing silence. And darkness. So thick you could almost touch it. Orlov came to, coughing. The dust was a thick column, making it impossible to breathe. He tried to stand, but a sharp pain in his shoulder made him groan. "Anyone alive?" he asked hoarsely into the darkness. Silence. His heart plummeted into an icy abyss. "Anyone alive, damn it?" he yelled now, not caring about the silence. "I'm here," came Lysenko's weak, choked voice from somewhere to the right. "Zubov? Alive, I think. My leg's pinned. Dead? Sterigin?" No answer. "Dead," Orlov shouted, his voice breaking. A cold dread filled his chest. He fumbled around, found his submachine gun, then his rucksack. The flashlight. He found it, and with difficulty, pressed the dynamo lever. A faint, whirring sound, and a dim, trembling beam of light cut through the gloom. The first thing he saw were Lysenko's eyes, wide open, full of horror. The corporal sat on the ground trying to cough up the dust. Then Orlov aimed the beam at Zubov. He was lying under a concrete slab that had pinned his leg. His face was as white as a sheet. "Hang in there, kid," Orlov rasped and began to look for Sterigin. He found him a few meters away. Dead was lying face down, covered in rubble. Orlov crawled to him, struggled to clear away the stones, and turned him over. Sterigin's face was covered in blood, but he was breathing. Unconscious, but breathing. Orlov felt a wave of immense relief. Everyone was alive. Now they had to figure out what had happened. He raised the flashlight and shone it in the direction they had come from. The beam wasn't strong enough to pierce the darkness, but he saw something that made his heart clench again. There was no way back. The tunnel was completely blocked. A wall of concrete, earth, and mangled rebar barred their path. "Walled in," Lysenko whispered, his voice filled with despair. Orlov shone the light forward. It was the same picture. A cave-in. They were in a stone coffin, no more than 30 or 40 meters, about 130 feet, long, buried alive. At that moment, Zubov, who had been silent until then, suddenly screamed. It was a high-pitched, almost feminine cry of terror and pain. "Sergeant, shine the light over here!" Orlov aimed the beam of light at him and at what was beside him. And what he saw was more terrifying than the cave-in, more terrifying than the darkness and the lack of air. Next to Zubov, just 2 meters away, embedded in the debris, lay she. A huge, blunt-nosed, olive-gray death. A 500-kilogram aerial bomb. Its nose was pointed directly at them. Orlov looked at his frightened, crushed men, then at the massive, deadly body of the bomb, then at the rubble that cut them off from the world. And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become not just their commander, but their jailer and their god. The first few hours after the disaster devolved into a viscous, sticky nightmare woven from darkness, pain, and primal terror. Time lost its meaning, stretching into an endless torture. The main sounds in their stone tomb were the moans of the wounded and the grinding of teeth in helplessness. Zubov was pinned by a concrete slab, and any attempt to move brought on sharp fits of pain. Sterigin remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and rattling. Orlov and Lysenko, both concussed and wounded themselves, scrambled in the narrow space trying to help their comrades. But what could they do in this pitch-black darkness with their bare hands? Zubov was the first to break. The panic that had been smoldering inside him erupted in an uncontrolled flood of words. "We're all going to die!" he screamed, his cracking voice echoing off the walls. We're trapped! We're going to die in here! Help! Shut up! Orlov barked, crawling toward him. He shone the flashlight beam directly into the boy's face. Zubov's eyes were wild, his pupils dilated with terror. He wasn't looking at Orlov, but through him at the dark, massive body of the bomb. It's going to explode! We're all going to be blown to bits! Sergeant, do something! I said shut up! Orlov grabbed him by the shirt and shook him hard. Get a grip, soldier. Panic will kill us faster than that piece of iron. But words had no effect. Zubov continued to scream and thrash hysterically. His cry, full of despair, was like a hammer blow to their already frayed nerves. And then Orlov hit him. Hard, a backhand slap across the face. Zubov fell silent, stunned. In the ensuing quiet, only his ragged, sobbing breath could be heard. One more sound, Orlov hissed, leaning close to his face, and I'll shoot you! Understand? Zubov nodded silently, tears streaming down his cheeks. Orlov let him go and crawled away. His hands were shaking. He hated himself for that blow, but he knew there had been no other choice. Panic is as contagious as the plague. If he hadn't stopped Zubov now, in 5 minutes they would all have been howling in terror like a pack of wolves, and that would have surely been the end of them. He pointed the flashlight at the bomb. It lay motionless, silent, as if mocking their fears. Its proximity was almost physically unbearable. It seemed to radiate an invisible cold that seeped under their clothes, into their very bones. Lysenko crawled over to Orlov. His face was gray with concrete dust, but a spark of reason burned in his eyes. What are we going to do, Sergeant? He asked in a whisper. That whisper became the first brick in the wall of their future empire of silence. Orlov thought for a moment. His mind was in chaos. He was a sapper, not a rescuer. He was taught to disarm, not to clear rubble. But right now, he was the commander. And these 3 men were looking to him with hope. First things first. The wounded, he replied, also in a whisper. We need to free Zubov's leg and bring Dead around. Then, we assess the situation. Figure out where we are and if there's any chance at all. The 2 of them crawled to the slab pinning Zubov. It was enormous. Moving it was impossible. We need a lever, Lysenko said. He felt around and found a long piece of rebar. They tried to wedge it under the slab. Every movement was torture. They were afraid to make a sound, afraid their efforts would send vibrations through the concrete. Zubov moaned through clenched teeth. Finally, they managed to lift the edge of the slab slightly. Pull, Orlov hissed. With a cry, Zubov yanked his leg free. Orlov immediately lowered the slab, trying to do it as smoothly as possible. Zubov's leg was bent at an unnatural angle, a fracture. Lysenko, using a first-aid dressing, managed to bandage it, splinting it with a piece of a board. Then they tended to Sterigin. Dead was unconscious, but they could feel a pulse. He had a large gash on his head. They cleaned it with the last of the water from Orlov's canteen and bandaged it. Once the most urgent first aid was administered, Orlov took inventory. What did they have? 4 submachine guns with incomplete ammo loads, 3 sapper shovels, 2 probes, 1 mine detector smashed to pieces, rucksacks with leftover hardtack and tobacco, 2 canteens, one of which was already nearly empty, and 1 dynamo flashlight. Not much, but their main weapon and their main enemy lay 2 meters away from them. The bomb. Orlov understood that everything depended on it. If it was unstable, they were doomed. If there was a chance it wouldn't detonate from the slightest sneeze, they had time. He took the flashlight and, telling the others not to move, slowly crawled toward it. His heart was pounding in his chest so loudly it felt like the beat could awaken the sleeping beast. He shone the light on its body, on the stabilizers, on the point where it met the rubble. He wasn't an expert on aerial bombs, but he knew a few things. British high-explosive bombs, 500 kilograms of amatol. The fuses could be of various types: impact, delayed action, hydrostatic, acoustic. God, anything. But this bomb hadn't exploded on impact. That meant the impact fuse either failed or wasn't there. It could have been a delayed action bomb, designed to penetrate several floors and detonate inside a building. Or worst of all, it had a non-contact fuse, sensitive to vibration or sound. He shone the light on its side. The paint had peeled in places and he saw the marking. HC500LB, high capacity. He crawled further, to its tail section. Where the fuse should have been, there was an empty space. Either it had been torn out on impact or... Orloff felt a chill run down his spine. He shone the light deep into the rubble where the bomb's nose was hidden, and he saw what made him hold his breath. Protruding from the bomb's casing near the nose cone were two thin metal whiskers. It was a Zunder C-type fuse. One of the most diabolical German fuses which they fitted to unexploded Allied bombs, turning them into booby traps. It reacted to the slightest tremor, and it was armed. A ringing silence fell. Orloff slowly crawled back to his men. His face was a mask. "What is it, Sergeant?" Lysenko asked in a whisper. Orloff looked at him, then at the terrified Zubov. He couldn't tell them the truth. The truth would kill them. It would crush their last will to resist. He had to lie. "The fuse is damaged," he said in a steady, confident voice. "It probably got jammed on impact. It shouldn't go off. But," he paused, looking at each of them with a heavy gaze, "that doesn't mean we can relax. Any strong vibration could set it off." From this moment on, his voice became as hard as steel. "We live by new rules. First, we only speak in whispers. Second, we move slowly and smoothly. No sudden movements. Third, no one does anything without my order. This is our only chance to survive. Is that clear?" Lysenko and Zubov nodded silently. It was a lie. A fragile, desperate lie. But in that moment, it became the foundation upon which they would build their system for survival. Orloff knew they were sitting on a powder keg with a lit fuse, and no one knew how much time they had left. Knowledge, even false knowledge, became their first weapon against the all-consuming horror. Sergeant Orloff's words, delivered with unshakable confidence, acted like a powerful sedative. The idea that the fuse was damaged and the bomb was probably safe became the straw their consciousness, drowning in despair, clung to. It was the first tiny victory. A victory of reason over primal fear. Now they faced a new, no less difficult task, to turn this fragile self-deception into a system for survival. Their enemy now was not just the bomb, but the very environment in which they found themselves. Their prison. Orloff, using his experience, began to act methodically and coolly, as if he were not in a collapsed tunnel, but on a training exercise. "Lysenko," he whispered, "you're the brains here. We need light. A constant light is no good. We'll kill the dynamo. But we need to see what we're doing. And we need water. Examine everything here. Every piece of wire, every pipe. Look for something to make a wick for a smudge pot and where water might be collecting." Lysenko nodded silently. For him, a man accustomed to working with small parts, this task was a salvation. It distracted him from thoughts of death, gave his inquisitive mind something to work on. He began to slowly, as if in a dream, survey their chamber. He felt the walls, covered with a damp film, picked at the seams between the tiles with his finger, dismantled pieces of electrical wiring hanging from the ceiling. Meanwhile, Orloff focused on the most important thing, the rubble. He knew their only path to salvation lay through this multi-ton barrier. But how to approach it? Any strike of a pickaxe, any shifted stone could cause a fatal vibration. "Zubov," he addressed the wounded man, "you will be our observer. Your job is to listen. Listen to the bomb. Any click, any creak. Report to me immediately." He gave Zubov this task not only so he wouldn't feel useless, Orlov truly believed the bomb might give signals before exploding. It was irrational, but in their situation no precaution was too much. Orlov himself, moving with the grace of a predator, began to explore the rubble. He didn't touch the stones. He studied them. How they lay, which one was the keystone, which could be removed with minimal consequences. It was the work of a jeweler, a surgeon. He inserted his fingers into the cracks, checking how tightly the fragments were wedged. He pressed his ear to the concrete, trying to catch the faintest sounds. An hour passed, or maybe 3. In their world without time, it didn't matter. The first piece of encouraging news came from Lysenko. "Sergeant," his whisper was full of excitement. "I have an idea. Look." He showed Orlov several pieces of copper wire he had pulled from a cable and a piece of some oily rag found in a corner. "The insulation can be used as a wick. It will be sooty, but it will burn for a long time. And the oil," he pointed to a switch machine gearbox sticking out from under the debris. "There should be oil in the crankcase. If we can get it, we'll have an almost eternal lamp." It was a brilliantly simple idea. Orlov nodded in approval. "Excellent, Corporal. Get to it. But be extremely careful. No scraping." While Lysenko, armed with a piece of sheet metal, tried to scoop out the precious oil, Orlov made a decision. They had to start clearing the rubble. Waiting for rescue from the outside was pointless. They had most likely been written off as dead. They could only rely on themselves. "We'll work like this," he whispered, gathering Lysenko and Zubov, who could only sit leaning against the wall. "I find a stone. I carefully loosen it. Lysenko, you help me. We pull it out and pass it to Zubov. Zubov stacks them against the opposite wall. Movements. Smooth. Not a single impact. Not a single sharp sound. A break every 15 minutes. We listen to the silence." "Understood." They began. It was hellish, exhausting work. Orlov, lying on his stomach, reached into the crevices, felt for a small stone that, by his calculations, could be pulled out without causing others to collapse. Then he and Lysenko together, almost holding their breath, pulled it toward them. The stone yielded reluctantly, with a scraping sound that sent a chilling terror through their hearts. In those moments, Zubov would press himself against the wall, his eyes growing huge, and he would stare, transfixed, at the bomb. But the bomb remained silent. The first stone, the second, the third. They passed them down the chain like some sacred relic. Their hands were covered in scrapes, their muscles ached from the strain. But they worked. A system, a rhythm appeared in their actions. This monotonous, dangerous work became their new reality, their way of fighting off madness. A few hours later, they had their first success. Lysenko had managed to fashion a smudge pot. He poured oil into a German biscuit tin found in the trash, inserted a wick made of insulation, and lit it with the last match, which had miraculously been found on dead Sterigin. A faint, sooty flame began to dance in the darkness, casting their grotesque, flickering shadows on the walls. This was not just light. It was a symbol of their first victory over the darkness. It was a hearth, the center of their small, dying world. They sat around it. Even dead Sterigin, who by then had regained consciousness but was still very weak, propped himself up on an elbow and watched the fire. In its light, their faces looked gaunt and surreal. "Water," Zubov rasped. Thirst was becoming unbearable. "There will be water," Orlov said confidently, though he himself didn't know where to get it. Lysenko said the walls are damp. That means it's seeping in from somewhere. They set back to work, but now they had light. They could see each other's faces, see their bloodied hands, see the rubble that still seemed insurmountable. And they could see her. In the light of the smudge pot, the bomb looked even more sinister. Its olive side gleamed in the uneven light, and it seemed to be watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. But now they looked at it without panicked horror. They were getting used to it. It was becoming a part of their existence, like the cold, the hunger, and the darkness. Their knowledge, their system, their little flame, all of it was their weapon. They had conquered panic, but they did not yet know that their hostile environment was preparing a new trial for them, that the smell of their breath and the faint warmth of their smudge pot would attract the attention of other inhabitants of this underworld. Those who were very, very hungry. With the appearance of light, their world gained boundaries and structure. The sooty flame in the tin can became the center of their universe, their sun. Around it, they built their entire existence, which Orloff organized with pedantic and iron will. He established the strictest daily routine, although they had no day. Everything was measured in cycles of work and rest. 45 minutes, clearing the rubble. 15 minutes, rest, during which everyone had to sit motionless and silent, listening to the quiet. This was not just rest. It was a ritual, a sacred act. They listened to the breathing of the bomb, the breathing of the tunnel, the beating of their own hearts. Orloff divided the duties. He and Lysenko, as the healthiest, did the main, most dangerous work, pulling stones from the rubble. Zubov, whose leg was swollen and painful, was in charge of the warehouse. He received the stones and carefully, without a sound, stacked them against the opposite wall. Dead Sterigan, who was slowly recovering, was appointed keeper of the fire and responsible for water. They found water. Lysenko had been right. In one place, a thin trickle seeped from the wall. They placed a pot under it, and after several hours, a few gulps of murky, musty-smelling liquid collected at the bottom. It was the most delicious water of their lives. They divided it equally, each taking one small sip. This water, like the fire, became a symbol of their small civilization, their empire, built from nothing in the midst of chaos. They developed an economy based on the strictest rationing. Orloff divided the last of the hardtack into tiny portions, one per man per day. He kept records in a captured German notebook he found in the pocket of the dead Volkssturm soldier. He wrote down how many stones they had cleared, how much water they had collected, how much hardtack they had eaten. This seemingly pointless accounting gave their existence meaning, creating an illusion of control over the situation. Orloff's leadership became absolute. His whisper was law. No one dared to contradict him. He was stern, but fair. He pushed them to work at the limit of their strength, but he himself worked harder than anyone. He sustained their hope with his imperturbable confidence, although inside, he felt a knot of fear tighten every time another stone grudgingly yielded to their efforts. Their small world, their empire of silence, gave them more than just the physical resources for survival. It gave them something more: psychological stability. The rituals, the routine, the clear hierarchy, all of this was a framework that kept their psyches from crumbling to dust. They were not just 4 walled-in soldiers. They were a crew, a team, a state. But their empire was built on a very fragile foundation. And that foundation began to crack. The first source of threat came from rats, huge, bold sewer rats, attracted by the smell of their meager food and warmth. At first, they just scurried in the darkness beyond the circle of light. Then they grew bolder and began to approach closer, their small, beady eyes watching the men's every move. One night, while everyone except Orloff, the watchman, was asleep, one of the rats tried to drag away the bag of hardtack. Orloff, without making a sound, threw his sapper shovel at it. He missed. The shovel hit the wall with a thud. The sound seemed as loud as a cannon shot to them. Everyone woke up instantly. They froze, turning into statues, and for several minutes that felt like an eternity. They waited. But the bomb remained silent. This incident showed just how vulnerable their position was, but it also suggested a new source of food. The next night, they set an ambush. Lysenko fashioned a snare from wire using a crumb of the last piece of hardtack as bait. They managed to catch one rat. Its squeal was short. Dead Sterigan, who had been a hunter in his village life, skinned it with his cobbler's knife. They roasted the meat over the flame of the smudge pot. It was tough, with an unpleasant taste, but it was food, protein, energy. They had become primitive hunters living in a cave. But the main enemy, undermining their empire from within, was not hunger, but the despair and fear that had never gone away. They had simply hidden in the depths of each man's soul, and the weakest link turned out to be Zubov. His physical pain from the broken leg was compounded by mental anguish. He was young, full of life, and the thought of a slow death in this stone tomb was unbearable for him. He began to change. His defiant smirk vanished, replaced by a sullen, haunted grimace. He fell silent more often, but his silence was heavy, full of hidden aggression. He began to doubt Orlov's actions. "We're digging like worms," he hissed one evening as they shared their portion of roasted rat. "We'll be clearing this rubble for 100 years. We're going to die here of thirst and hunger." "There is no other way, Zubov," Orlov replied calmly. "There is." Zubov raised his voice, but then fell silent in fear and switched to a furious whisper. "That thing," he nodded at the bomb, "it's not going to explode. You said yourself the fuse is broken. We need to take a pickaxe and smash this damn rubble to pieces. We could be out of here in a couple of hours." "I said the fuse is damaged, not broken," Orlov articulated. "That means it could go off from anything. I forbid you to even think about the pickaxe. That's an order." "To hell with your order!" The fire of madness flared in Zubov's eyes. "You're just scared. You want us all to rot here alive." Lysenko and Ded remained silent, watching the scene. The air was thick with tension, like swamp mire. The seed of doubt Zubov had planted began to sprout. What if he was right? What if their caution was excessive and they were just wasting precious time? Orlov saw it in their eyes. His authority, his power, built on a fragile lie, was shaken. Their life, their small, orderly world, had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. In the darkness of their stone tomb, a rebellion began to brew. A rebellion that could be the last event of their lives. The internal conflict, which had been smoldering under the ashes of fear and discipline, flared up with new force. Thirst was the catalyst. The water from the wall trickled more and more slowly, and now it was barely enough to wet their lips. Dehydration made them weak, irritable, their thoughts viscous and confused. Zubov suffered the most. His broken leg burned with fire, and his body cried out for moisture. His despair, fueled by physical pain, was turning into a blind rage directed at the one who had set the unbearable rules of the game, Sergeant Orlov. Zubov began to engage in subversive activities. He spoke to Lysenko and Ded when Orlov was busy at the rubble, his whisper as venomous as a snake's. "He's deceiving us," he hissed. "He's just a coward, afraid to take a risk. And we're dying here because of him. Look at us, we've become shadows. And up there, our boys are already taking the Reichstag, celebrating victory. And we're sitting here, waiting for this piece of iron to deign to finish us off. Or until we tear each other's throats out for the last drop of water." Ded Sterigin listened to him in silence, shaking his head in disapproval. His life experience told him that order, even the cruelest, was better than anarchy. But Lysenko hesitated. He was a man of logic, and there was a terrible, distorted logic to Zubov's words. Their slow work did indeed resemble a Sisyphean task. They had been clearing the rubble for several days, and it seemed no smaller. The chance of dying of thirst was very real, perhaps even more real than the chance of dying in an explosion. Orlov felt this growing tension. He saw how the gazes of his subordinates were changing, how doubt was appearing in them. He understood that his dictatorship was hanging by a thread. He tried to talk to them to explain that their only enemy was haste, that a sapper has no right to take risks. But his words, which had so recently been law to them, were now drowning in a fog of thirst and despair. The climax came on the 6th day. The water in the pot ran out, completely. The wall was dry. It was a death sentence. Everyone understood that. They sat around the barely smoldering smudge pot in complete silence. And in this silence, A scraping sound was suddenly heard. Everyone turned. Zubov, leaning against the wall, had risen to his good leg. In his hand he held the pickaxe, which they had not used until now, afraid to even touch it. His face was contorted in a grimace of determination and madness. "Enough," he rasped. "I'm not waiting anymore. I want to live. I'll get out of here or die trying." "Put down the pickaxe, Zubov." Orlov's voice was icy. There was no anger in it, only a cold, deadly threat. He slowly rose, positioning himself between Zubov and the rubble. "Don't come any closer, Sergeant." Zubov held the pickaxe out in front of him like a spear. "I don't want to touch you. Just step aside. Let me pass." "You'll kill us all," Orlov said just as quietly. "We're already dead men," Zubov shrieked. "I'm giving us a chance, and you're taking it away." He took a step toward the rubble, and Orlov lunged at him. It was the most terrifying fight of their lives, a silent, desperate struggle between two men just feet away from 500 kilograms of explosives. They didn't shout. They didn't hit each other. They wrestled like fighters in thick mud, trying to throw each other down, to wrench the pickaxe away. All that could be heard was their heavy, stifled breathing, grunts of effort, and the dull thuds of their bodies against the ground and walls. Lysenko and Dead watched, frozen with horror. They didn't know what to do, who to support. This was not just a fight for a pickaxe. It was a clash of two ideologies. Cold, calculated reason versus a mad, desperate impulse. Orlov was stronger, but Zubov, fueled by adrenaline and madness, was like a wild animal. He writhed, bit, tried to headbutt Orlov. Finally, Orlov managed to twist his arm and tear the pickaxe from his grasp. He threw it into the far corner of the tunnel. It hit the wall with a loud metallic clang that made them all freeze and press themselves to the floor. They waited. A second. 2. 10. A minute. No explosion followed. The bomb had spared them again. Orlov was breathing heavily, standing over the defeated Zubov. He had won this fight, but he knew he had lost something greater. He saw in the eyes of Lysenko and Dead not relief, but fear. Fear of him. He, their leader and savior, had become a cruel jailer in their eyes, ready to kill for disobedience. His empire was on the verge of collapse. The rebellion had been physically suppressed, but its poisonous seeds had already taken root in the souls of the others. He had upheld his law, but while they were fighting amongst themselves, they had failed to notice how their real enemy, a slow death from dehydration, was preparing its final, crushing blow. After the fight, a heavy, oppressive silence fell in the tunnel, broken only by Zubov's sobs and Orlov's heavy breathing. The atmosphere was electrified to the limit. The brotherhood they had built with such difficulty in this hell had crumbled to dust. Now they were not comrades in misfortune, but 3 prisoners and their guard. Orlov knew he could achieve nothing more by force. He had to win back their trust, give them new hope, or the next outburst of madness would be their last. He sat down next to Lysenko and Dead. His face was gaunt. "I know what you're thinking," he whispered. "That I'm a tyrant. That I'm keeping you here and leading you to certain death. Maybe you're right. But I'm a sapper, and I know what an explosion is. It's not a quick death like Zubov thinks. It's fire that burns your lungs. It's a shockwave that tears you to pieces. I've seen it dozens of times, and I don't want you to see it. As long as there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that this thing is silent for a reason, we will work quietly. But," he paused, "I understand we can't wait any longer. The water is gone. We are at our limit." He looked at the rubble. In all these days they had only cleared the upper part of it. It was a colossal effort, but it had not brought them closer to salvation. "I think we're digging in the wrong place," Lysenko said suddenly. His voice was quiet, but confident. "We're trying to break through to the top, where we came from. But the collapse was too severe. There are tons of earth there. We'll never clear it. What if we tried digging sideways?" Everyone looked at him. "What do you mean?" Orlov asked. "This is a subway. Lysenko explained. "The tunnels don't just hang in a void. There must be technical rooms, cable ducts, drainage systems nearby. The tunnel walls," he tapped the tiles with his knuckles, "they're not solid. Maybe there's a passage somewhere." It was a new, completely unexpected idea. They had been so fixated on the rubble that they hadn't even considered other options. Lysenko's idea was like a ray of light in the darkness. It gave them a new goal, a new hope. They began to tap the walls, carefully, barely touching, first with their knuckles, then with the handle of a knife. Most of the time the sound was dull, dead, but in one spot, not far from the rubble, the sound changed. It became more resonant, clearer. There was an empty space behind the wall. "Here," Lysenko whispered. Their hearts began to beat faster. This was their chance. But how to break through the wall without using the pickaxe? They began to work with their sapper shovels, trying to pry out the tiles and the mortar between the concrete blocks. It was painstaking, hellish work. The mortar was as hard as stone. Their fingers, already worn to the quick, burned like fire. But now they worked together. The rebellion was forgotten. They had a common, meaningful goal. Even Zubov, overcoming the pain, crawled closer and helped as much as he could, clearing away debris, holding the flashlight. Several more hours passed. They took turns, working to the point of complete exhaustion. Finally, they managed to pull out one concrete block. Behind it, there was indeed an empty space, a narrow, dark passage from which a smell of old dampness emanated. This was their final battle with the abyss that had swallowed them. They didn't know what awaited them there, in that darkness. Maybe another cave-in, maybe a flooded collector, or maybe salvation. Lysenko, as the thinnest, went first. Orlov squeezed in after him. Ded and Zubov stayed behind to wait. The passage was very narrow. They crawled on their stomachs, scraping their skin on the sharp edges of the concrete. After a few meters, the passage led them into a small technical room filled with some junk, but at the far end, they saw it. A metal ladder going straight up into a dark shaft. They shone the flashlight upward. High above, about 15 meters, 50 feet, they saw a dim gleam, a sewer grate, and through it, a gray, dull light was breaking through. Daylight. Orlov felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was salvation. They had done it. They had won. He returned to Ded and Zubov. "There's a way out," he whispered, his voice trembling. "A ladder. Up to the street." Something resembling a smile appeared on their emaciated faces. It was the smile of dead men returned to life. They helped Ded out first, then with great difficulty they dragged the wounded Zubov through. The climb up the ladder was the final test of their strength. Zubov moaned in pain but kept climbing, gripping the rungs with his good hand. Orlov and Lysenko supported him from below. Finally they reached the manhole. Orlov pushed against it with his shoulder. The grate didn't give way at first. It screeched, and the sound seemed louder than any explosion. But they no longer cared. Orlov stuck his head out. Fresh, cold air hit his face. The sky was gray, veiled in smoke. All around were ruins and silence. Not the oppressive silence of the underground, but a different ringing silence of a destroyed city. They were out. They had survived. But the price of their victory was terrible. They were exhausted to the limit, on the brink of life and death. And it was at that very moment in the ensuing quiet that a shout came from around the corner of a ruined building. "Stop! Hände hoch!" But this was not a cry of terror. It was a sharp, guttural command in Russian. The euphoria of rescue was short-lived, replaced by shock and confusion. Blinded even by the dim daylight, they didn't immediately understand what was happening. From behind the ruins, several soldiers in Soviet uniforms, but with unfamiliar faces, were running toward them. They held them at gunpoint. "Who are you?" A stocky sergeant major with a suspicious look shouted at them. "Why are you crawling out of the ground? Saboteurs?" Orlov, squinting, tried to stand. His legs gave way and he leaned on the edge of the manhole. "Friendlies," he rasped. "Sappers. From General Perepyolkin's assault group. We were trapped in a cave-in." The sergeant major came closer, not lowering his submachine gun. He and his soldiers looked at them with unconcealed mistrust. And one could understand them. The rescued men looked monstrous, overgrown with beards, in tattered, filthy clothes, with black, sunken eyes and faces gray with dust. They looked more like ghosts or concentration camp inmates than soldiers of the Red Army. "Papers," the sergeant major said curtly. Orlov, with difficulty, unbuttoned his tunic and pulled out his military ID, soaked and crumpled. The sergeant major took it squeamishly, turned it over in his hands, looked at the photo, then at Orlov. "Doesn't look like you," he delivered his verdict. "Where were you trapped? What were you doing down there?" "In the metro tunnel," Orlov waved his hand toward the manhole. "A week ago. There's an unexploded bomb. 500 kilograms. The soldiers exchanged glances. Open disbelief mixed with pity appeared on their faces. Orlov's story sounded like the ravings of a madman. To survive for a week, cuddling with a half-ton bomb, that only happens in soldiers' tall tales. "All right, let's go," the sergeant major softened. "The commander will sort it out. And you," he nodded at the wounded Zubov, "get him to the medics." They were led through the ruined streets. For the 4 sappers, it was a return to another world. They had lived for 7 days in silence and darkness, and now the sounds of battle, the shouts, the roar of tanks, were deafening. They greedily breathed the fresh air, which seemed sweet after the stale atmosphere of the tunnel. They were taken to a headquarters located in the basement of an intact building. The commander turned out to be a young captain from a special department. He interrogated them for a long, painstaking time. Orlov repeated his story again and again, but the captain listened with a stone face, taking notes in a notebook. "So you say 7 days? Underground? With a bomb?" He smirked skeptically. "And how did you survive without food and water?" "We ate rats," Orlov answered quietly. "We collected water from the walls." The captain gave him a long, searching look. Then he shifted his gaze to Lysenko, to Ded, to Zubov, who had already received first aid. He saw their condition, their exhaustion, but the story still seemed too incredible to him. Deserters? Hiding out in a basement while others shed their blood? Or maybe German collaborators? "We'll verify your story, Sergeant," he finally said. "Send them to the medical battalion, under guard, and find out everything about General Perepyolkin's assault group." For Orlov and his men, this was a blow. Instead of being greeted as heroes, they were treated like criminals. Their rescue had turned into a new prison of mistrust and humiliation. Their incredible feat, their 7-day struggle for life, turned out to be an inconvenient, implausible truth that no one wanted to believe. In the medical battalion, they were washed, given clean clothes, and fed hot porridge. After starvation, this food seemed like the food of the gods. But even here they felt the suspicious, sideways glances. They were kept in a separate tent with a guard at the entrance. 2 days later, the same captain from the special department came. His face was no longer so harsh. "Your story has been confirmed, Sergeant," he said without any preamble. "General Perepyolkin's assault group did indeed lose a sapper squad in the metro tunnels. They were considered killed in the collapse." There was no joy in Orlov's voice, only endless fatigue. "And the bomb?" he asked. "We sent men down there. They confirmed it. The cave-in, the bomb, it's all there. It's impossible to get it out. They decided to just seal off that section of the tunnel, to be on the safe side." The captain paused, then added, "You will be recommended for decorations, for courage." But it sounded somehow uncertain, formal. The system didn't like such stories. They didn't fit into the heroic reports. They were too terrifying, too human. The investigation confirmed their story. But instead of immediate decorations, they received an order to disband the squad and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Their brotherhood, their small empire, forged in the darkness of the underground, was destroyed by a single stroke of a pen. Their fate was buried alive, just like that bomb, in a sealed-off tunnel. Fate, having pulled them from one grave, immediately prepared another for them, no less terrible, the grave of oblivion. Their small squad, which had become a single organism in the struggle for life, was ruthlessly dismembered and thrown back into the meat grinder of war. They no longer existed as a single unit. Sergeant Orlov, Corporal Lysenko, Private Sterigin, and Private Zubov were scattered among different units, as if to erase the very memory of their shared hell. They were deemed fit for active duty. No one inquired about their mental state. No one paid attention to the fact that their eyes looked at the world as if through a dark glass. Their psychological trauma, their week-long horror, remained their personal, unspoken hell. Sergeant Orlov ended up in an assault group that took the Reichstag. He fought fiercely with a feral desperation, as if trying to drown out the ringing silence that had taken up permanent residence in his soul. He survived. He went through the whole war and returned home. But civilian life proved to be another ordeal for him. He couldn't sleep in silence. He was tormented by nightmares in which he was back in that dark tunnel next to the silent olive-colored death. He started drinking, heavily until he blacked out. He tried to tell his story to his drinking buddies, but they just laughed, dismissing it as drunken rambling. He died in 1963 from cirrhosis of the liver, quietly, in his own bed. He was buried in an old cemetery without military honors. He never received the decoration promised to him by that captain. Corporal Lysenko, the watchmaker with the soul of an engineer, was also sent to the front line. His unique talents no longer interested anyone. He was just an infantryman, one of many. He was killed by a stray shell fragment on May 1st, 1945, the day before the fall of Berlin. He lay on the cobblestones of a Berlin street staring at the gray sky with his faded, all-understanding eyes. In his clenched fist, a small bent gear was found, all that remained of his peaceful life. Private Zubov, with his broken leg, ended up in a hospital. He survived, but he never returned to the front, being discharged due to his wound. His subsequent fate is unknown. It was said that he never recovered from the ordeal, went mad, and ended his days in a mental institution. He always spoke in a whisper and was afraid of loud noises. The fate of dead Sterigin, the oldest and wisest, was the most tragic and at the same time the most luminous. As the eldest, he was sent to the rear, to a team for demining liberated cities. He did what he knew best, disarming death. In 1946 in Dresden, he was working on a British aerial bomb identical to the one in their tunnel. He had almost finished the job when something went wrong. There was a soft click. Sterigin understood everything. He managed to shout to his young assistants to run. They made it. He did not. He accepted his death calmly, like an old hunter meeting the master of the taiga in the forest. He returned to the silence in which he had lived the 7 most terrifying and most important days of his life. Their feat was officially forgotten. Not a single document, not a single mention of Sergeant Orlov's squad remained in the archives. Their story dissolved in time, like thousands of other similar stories that the war machine grinds up and spits out without number. But, as the local boys in that part of Berlin where the tunnel was once sealed told it, even in the 60s, sometimes at night, a strange, barely audible knocking could be heard from under the ground, from the sewer manholes, as if someone down there, in the deep, was still trying to get out. Someone everyone had forgotten. Official history, written by the victors, has no tolerance for such narratives. It has room for mass heroism, for great battles and wise commanders. But it has no room for 4 men trapped in the dark, for their quiet madness, for their victory over their own fear, which turned out to be needed by no one. Their feat did not make it into the war chronicles. Their names are not carved on memorial plaques, they simply vanished, erased by the indifferent eraser of history. But human memory is structured differently. What paper forgets, a whisper remembers. The story of Sergeant Orlov and his men did not die with them. It survived. It became a legend, a soldier's tale that veterans of the Berlin operation told their grandchildren on quiet evenings when the memories came flooding back. They said that somewhere in Berlin, underground, there is a cursed tunnel where 4 shadows, 4 sapper ghosts, still sit and carry on their endless conversation with a huge bomb. There was a belief among the soldiers that if you listened closely while passing old entrances to the U-Bahn, you could hear a quiet whisper and the clatter of stones. It is them, the walled-in ones, continuing their work, trying to break through to the light. This story turned into a myth, a parable about how the most terrible enemy in war is not the enemy with a submachine gun, but the one that sits inside you. It is a story of how professionals, whose job it is to disarm death, became its hostages themselves. About how the vibration of the human soul, the tremor of fear and despair, can be more dangerous than any shockwave. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? Was their victory worth complete oblivion? There is no answer to this question. Their feat did not change the course of the war. It did not save thousands of lives. It saved only 4. And perhaps therein lies its tragic greatness, in the fact that in the midst of a global, all-consuming madness, in a small, dark hell beneath the earth, 4 men were able to create their own empire of order, their own civilization of silence, and prove that the human spirit can survive even when everything else dies. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten military episode. It is a reminder that every war has 2 sides, the parade side, shown on film, and the trench side, told in whispers. And the second is usually far more terrifying and true. And as long as we remember these whispers, these forgotten legends, those who lived through them will not disappear without a trace. They will live on in these stories, as eternal guardians of silence in the very heart of a ruined world.